love-hate relationship with these kinds of stories in the Bible. These stories of miracles, and these stories of life being raised from the dead, and these stories where Jesus just seems to show up right in the nick of time. I mean, I love them because they speak of so much of what I want to believe life can be. That anything is possible. That if I pray hard enough or long enough, well then, that person that I love so much lying in the hospital bed can be made well. I want this to be true. And yet I struggle with these stories because they bewilder me and they confound me, because miraculous healing hasn't always been my experience. I have seen people make amazing recoveries, and I have known people to go into remission. And I have seen things raised from the dead, things like love that people thought was long lost, and churches that are barely on life support, and people who claw their way back after a stroke or a heart attack. But I also know that these miraculous healings don't happen for everyone. And I'm not willing to reduce the gospel of Christ by not facing these realities in light of these biblical stories. So it was a strange week for me to pray over these stories because I saw Vi in the hospital and worried. And while I didn't want to think the worst, I will admit to you that I was scared for her and for Buzz. But I also want to say that she's making amazing progress. And by the end of the week, my heart sort of soared when I went in to see her. And she was, almost flirting with her physical therapist and cracking jokes. But I couldn't help but think about how unfair these stories are as she lies there. And this week, I also met with an older firefighter and his wife who are facing the reality of the ruthlessness of cancer. And they are able to articulate all their life's blessings. That the fire department and their children and the nurse that comes out to visit are all blessings. And it is exquisite to watch them remember and relive the good old days. And to catch glimpses of them, how they love one another, and how they can sort of give like that, oh honey look that you can only give somebody that you've been married to for, 50 years. And these are people that you so much want to help, but you know that you can't fix it. And when you leave, they say to you, all we need is for you to pray for us. So stories such as these in the Bible seem almost untrue in the face of that. And it's also true that just about 2 years ago, at this very time, Don lost his mother and my boys lost their grandmother. And we all wanted that miracle of healing that occurs in these stories. We were even bold enough to ask for it. And while my intellectual theology will tell me that doing one more thing and believing a little bit harder and trusting God just a little bit more wasn't what would save her, you better believe that when the person that you love is lying in a hospital bed, your heart tells you otherwise. Your heart tells you that if you just believed a little bit more, maybe it would get better. And you better believe that when that person dies, and you read stories like these, you're going to question why them, and why not me. It's hard to make sense of life in light of these stories. And I cannot begin to fathom the answers to the questions that rattle around in all of our heads. Why the widow's son and why not your mother? Or why the centurion's slave and why not your mentor? Why in the Bible? And why not the millions of other people across the ages who have lived with illnesses and pain? Why? And I know that there are very, very few answers to these questions. And I also know that it's better for me to look for the miracles that do come. But it's still true that the questions creep into my mind, and they creep into my heart and into my relationship with God. When I sent the image on your bulletin, on the front of the cover, when I sent it to Phyllis, she looked at it and finally said to me, "Okay, it's a great picture, but I don't get it. Yeah. Shouldn't we have something about healing on the cover?" And I said, "It is about healing." And so she looked at it more and more, trying to decide what it was about. And her interpretations were fairly interesting. I was even on the cover, so I was so very flattered. But, you know, hopefully you're sort of glancing at it, at least right now. What it says, if you look at it, that we desperately want to believe it's possible, but that everything in the world tells us and shows us that it really isn't. It says that life is confusing, and half the time we don't know where to turn. Because if you look, see the guy on the left-hand side of your bulletin? The guy with the halo, it's sort of a dead giveaway, that's Jesus. And the guy on the right-hand side, that's not even the centurion. That is the centurion's friend. And he's telling Jesus that the centurion has servants that go when he says go, and come when he says come, and that they do when they do, when he says to do. The centurion can get people to do as he wants through all of his words. And so in that little bubble, you see like all the words of the centurion floating around, right? But the centurion doesn't have control over sickness or death. He doesn't even have control over Jesus. But he does want to ask Jesus for help, to help him, and to help his slave. But he's afraid. And he almost chickens out because he tells his friends to go to Jesus and say, don't really bother. I'm not quite sure about it. Because if you ask, and things don't go the way you want them, then what do you have left? Maybe it's better not to ask. Maybe he's afraid to hope. And then there's the woman in the other story, right? It's a similar situation, except for it's a bit worse because her son has died. This mother has lost her only son. And it's hard for many of us who have children to imagine that there could be anything worse. Now, I don't know exactly what transpired between the time when the son got sick and when he died. I don't know if the woman begged and pleaded with God and nothing happened. I don't know if there were periods when the son was better for a time. And I don't even know if she had ever heard of Jesus. What I do know, based on this story, is that she has no words left. Only tears. A broken woman who has lost all hope. And that is a very desperate place to be. See, in these stories, it would actually be really easy to redact it to a faith comparison. The centurion has great faith because he asks. And the woman seemingly does not because she doesn't ask. Although the outcome is the same. Jesus heals. And I believe this to be true, that God doesn't pick and choose when to show up based on some heavenly faith-o-meter. But the good news in the story for each and every one of us isn't about the amount of faith we have or don't have. And it isn't even about miracles happening, although I do believe that they happen. But the good news lies in the centurion's words. You say the word. You, Jesus, say it. Because I know that I cannot. And the good news lies in the woman's tears. Because she has no words. And the tears are coming so fast that even if she could speak, she can't speak. And so Jesus speaks the words first to her. The good news lies in the promise that the hope is one thing that will never die, even when everything around us and everyone around us tells us otherwise. But the great news is that Jesus will speak when we cannot, which is weird good news But most of the time, I feel like the centurion. Do I ask? Do I not ask? If I ask, what do I ask for? And if I do, what will happen if I don't get it? Or I feel like the woman, and I only have tears left, and the thought of asking has hardly even crossed my mind. The only thing we have left to cling to then is hope. That Jesus will speak again. Because he always, always does. That is what we see in every single miracle story in the Bible. That Jesus has never failed to speak hope into a terrible situation. It doesn't always mean the dead are raised, but that hope is always spoken. That's what these stories are actually about. If these heart-wrenching pains were not real, then to sing as we do in church, to sing of the cross of Christ would be downright pathological. To proclaim that God died, new pain and new abandonment and new loss would be totally and completely morbid if it were not for the truth that Jesus knew all these things and knew one profound truth. That without hope, life fades before our eyes. And sometimes Jesus knew we would be afraid to hope, and afraid to speak, and afraid to ask. Now, the truth is, I am still scared to hope sometimes, even though I've heard this message over and over again. So I'm glad that the centurion and the woman are afraid too. It means that the reality of hope doesn't depend on me. It's all about Jesus. All about Jesus' promise to always and forever continue to speak hope into our lives. I said in the beginning that I have this love-hate relationship with these kinds of stories. When they're sort of in this paper form in front of us, and they're sort of set squarely before me. You will remember that I mentioned meeting this fireman and his wife this week. Well, there's this part of this conversation that I didn't tell you about. And it included their decision to receive hospice care, which means no more chemo. It means nothing else radical. It means no more prolonging of life. It means that they're at a point in their lives when they say, death is near. Hospice seems like the end of life. An acceptance that there is not much hope left. The flat page version would say to me that all hope is lost if all we did was read, the sergeant has begun hospice. But I'll tell you something, that's not true. Sitting there before them, hearing them speak, what I heard them talk about was how from this point on their lives would be lived. It's hard to think that you can still live life as you're facing death, because it makes you more vulnerable. And hope hurts sometimes. But discovering what it means to hope, even in the face of death, is discovering life again. Hospice for them is hoping for something different, hoping for a new life. So the truth is, if we're willing to wipe away the tears when Jesus says, don't weep, what we will also hear Jesus whisper is this: hope often arises differently than what you will hope for. Jesus promises to raise you up in hope, and that hope is what will heal you. And that is Jesus' consistent and surprising and miraculous promise. And that we can give thanks to God for.